You recently reintroduced the Fifth Amendment Integrity Restoration Act, the FAIR Act, with Representative Tim Walberg. Can you give us the history behind the legislation?
Well, I'll give you my personal history behind it because I was fighting this battle very much as a state senator in Maryland because it came to my attention that there were lots of cases of the police stopping people in the street or stopping them in their cars and not arresting them, not charging them with any offense, but saying, it looks like you might be involved in drugs. It looks like you might be up to no good. I'm just going to take your car, or I'm going to take your money. Give me all your money. Or I'll take some other piece of property on you. And then the person had to go to court, find a lawyer, and sue to get their property back. And so it totally turned on its head every understanding I had from the Constitution about the presumption of innocence and due process. And the same thing is taking place, but on a much broader magnitude at the federal level, where we're talking about billions of dollars that are being forfeited to the FBI and the Department of Justice and other agencies. And again, all of the constitutional presumptions are reversed. So the government's just laying claim to people's property, taking it, and then the person has to go out and get a lawyer to try to sue the government to get it back, instead of the government having first to prosecute you and prove beyond a reasonable doubt you did something, and then prove that the property was involved in the crime, either as an instrument of the crime or a proceed of the crime. But instead, the government is just taking it, and then you've got to, fight tooth and nail to get it back. So our legislation would try to restore constitutional coherence to this interaction between the government and the citizen.
Congressman, you bring up a really interesting point about the presumption of innocence. Are civil asset forfeiture laws, as written now, basically guilty until proven innocent?
Well, your property is guilty until proven innocent. And so we're making sure, Congressman Walberg and I want to make sure that if the government seizes your property, whether it's a car, it's a boat, it's your money, it's jewelry, whatever it might be, that the government has to very quickly go and create a proceeding, usually 7 days, or it has to notify you within 7 days it's gotten it and declare exactly what it is. And then within 14 days, it's got to come in and try to prove that by clear and convincing evidence that your property is ill-gotten gains or was an instrument, a tool of crime, and therefore can be seized by the government. But it's got to make the proof. And we're ending the process of so-called administrative forfeitures, where an agency or police department or the FBI could just declare that your property is up to no good and take it from you. Instead, it's got to be run through a neutral, independent magistrate. A court has got to do it, and they've got to prove by clear and convincing evidence that your property is implicated in some kind of crime. But some of these stories will break your heart. I get them all the time now. There's one that involving a woman named Linda Martin, who wanted to save her money in a safe deposit box. A lot of people are afraid of banks, and hey, I mean, you see the news, that's not totally deranged to be afraid of banks. But anyway, she wanted to save her money, which is a totally lawful thing to do, in a safe deposit box. And the company, U.S. Private Vaults, got charged with stuff by the government, and then they seized everybody's private assets, and they were all kind of guilty by association, and she hadn't done anything other than put her money in there to be saved. There was a case that I dealt with in Maryland where a guy lived in Baltimore, but he was going to college in Western Maryland, so he's driving back and forth, and he got stopped in a car that he had bought recently, and the police did a search of the car and found traces of the car, which had been a used car. They found traces of marijuana in the back seat, which apparently you can find in like 50% of the cars in America, traces of marijuana. So they did a search of him. He had no marijuana on him. He wasn't smoking marijuana. He wasn't dealing marijuana. He had nothing to do with marijuana. He was traveling between him and his wife and daughter in Baltimore and going to school, but they just seized his car. So then he had no way to get to school. So then he was forced to drop out of school because he couldn't go. He forfeited an entire semester's tuition. He's a poor working class guy. And if it hadn't been for, I think it was the ACLU or maybe the Institute of Justice, he never would have been able to get it back. But finally, 2 years later, he was able to get it back. But in the meantime, they completely disrupted his life. The stories like this are legion. I mean, just story after story where you got police seizing people's property. You find out about the innocent ones. Some of them are people who might have been like smoking pot. Take that example of somebody who had been smoking pot and then they seized their car. Well, I don't know what I think about that. I mean, it's against the law to possess marijuana. There's a penalty for that. But seizing somebody's car and making it impossible for them to get to work and take their kids to school or whatever, I mean, it's just wrong. So anyway, we're trying to restore the rule of law to this whole field because there's something that's kind of monarchical about the idea that we live in like a kingdom and the king's forces can just go out and seize everybody's property.
Congressman, off the top of your head, you just said 2 stories. You said you have countless stories just like this, and you've called this before. It's becoming standard operating procedure in many parts of the country. How did this become what you describe as standard?
Well, there's a financial motive and there's a financial incentive there. It works different ways in different jurisdictions, but generally the law enforcement agency that's doing it and whatever cooperating agencies get a cut out of the money. And, I've seen cases where police departments build entire new gymnasiums, they build a swimming pool. Sometimes if they get a fancy car from a suspected drug dealer, the force gets to keep it for their use, condos, you name it. I mean, so another thing that our legislation does is it terminates the profit incentive for federal law enforcement to be forfeiting people's property by requiring that the proceeds be sent in to the General Treasury Fund rather than kept by the seizing entity.
The ACLU has called civil forfeiture, quote, policing for profit, generating millions of dollars annually that police departments get to keep. Under your legislation, where would forfeiture proceeds go?
I mean, it goes to the American people through the General Treasury Fund. So obviously we have deficits and debt in the country. If this money is lawfully seized, if it really is ill-gotten gains, if it really is a boat that's being used for purposes of drug dealing, and there's a civil asset forfeiture statute, and then it is properly forfeited by having the government bring an action, and it's proven by clear and convincing evidence that it's being used criminally and due process is observed, and finally the boat is then forfeited, then it should be sold and the money should go into the General Treasury, or the boat should be used for perhaps other purposes, but it shouldn't go to the agents who happen to make the bust. I think everybody can see the moral hazard involved in that, and that cuts against the idea of law enforcement being for a public purpose and not for the purpose of enriching or feathering the nest of a particular agency or law enforcement department.
Congressman, I'm really interested to know what the response has been to your legislation. I talked to your colleague, Representative Tim Walberg, the Republican who introduced this with you, or rather reintroduced this with you. He said he's been working on this for a few terms now, almost 6 years. So what's the likelihood of this getting passed?
Well, I think that there are a lot of progressives who are very upset about this. There are a lot of progressives who represent urban areas where this kind of shakedown is a common practice, where police will see a young person on the street, who has $50 or $100 on them and say, there's no way that's really your money, that's drug money, and just take it from them. And then it goes theoretically to the department, or who knows where it goes. But there are also a lot of people from rural areas who are familiar with this practice as well. And so I think it cuts across urban and rural lines, and it cuts across party lines. And, I think there is at least a libertarian wing of the Republican Party that doesn't like this. There is a kind of more authoritarian, quote, law and order component within the Republican Party, which might not want to mess with the whole bureaucracy of civil asset forfeiture. But in truth, this doesn't have much to do with law and order at all. I mean, this is pretty lawless, the practice that's taking place. And it feels like it's very much at odds with the values of democracy and freedom that are really at the heart of our Constitution.